The afternoon rain had just begun when Laura Bennett heard the front door open, and she stepped out of the kitchen expecting the usual sound of her son Ethan and his best friend Michael laughing as they dropped their backpacks in the hallway. But today everything felt different the second she saw Michael standing alone in the living room, his shoulders tight and his eyes fixed on the floor as though he was afraid to look up. And Laura immediately sensed something was wrong because Michael was normally polite, quiet, and always greeted her with a gentle smile, yet now he seemed locked inside himself, breathing shallowly as if holding in something heavy, and before she could speak, the room felt filled with an invisible tension that made her heartbeat slow. So she asked softly if he was okay, watching him swallow hard as though the answer was trapped in his throat. He whispered her name in a voice so thin it barely reached her, and for a moment she thought he might faint because his hands trembled at his sides, but he kept staring at the floor like the truth he carried was too delicate to face the world, and Laura stepped closer, feeling a strange mix of worry and protectiveness, because she had known Michael since he was a small boy, shy, thoughtful, always trying to be strong even when life seemed too heavy for him, and she had watched him grow through the years beside Ethan like a second son. So seeing him like this made her chest tighten with concern. Michael tried again, saying he needed to tell her something important, and his voice cracked in a way that made her heart twist because it didn't sound like a casual confession, it sounded like something that had been buried for a long time, something he had been afraid to say out loud, and while he struggled for words, Laura felt the air shift as if the room itself knew something meaningful was about to be revealed. But before Michael could speak, the moment shattered with Ethan's loud voice calling from upstairs that he needed to grab his notes, and the sound startled Michael like a door slamming shut inside his mind, making him step back quickly, closing himself again behind the walls he had started to lower. He whispered later in a defeated tone, and Laura watched him pull away emotionally as if the chance to speak had slipped between his fingers. And though Ethan came downstairs moments later, cheerful and unaware of what had happened, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that something much deeper was happening inside Michael, something he didn't know how to express, something that frightened him enough to freeze his entire body. As the rain grew heavier outside, she watched Michael avoid her eyes during the rest of the afternoon, always turning away when she looked at him, always catching his breath whenever Ethan laughed, and it made her wonder if the thing he wanted to share wasn't just sad. It was personal, emotional, and maybe even painful, a truth he feared might hurt someone or change something important. Laura tried to focus on normal conversation, but her mind kept returning to that moment when Michael stood alone looking at the floor with that raw, lost expression, and she felt an instinctive urge to protect him, to help him, because he looked like someone carrying too much on young shoulders, someone who didn't know where to put his feelings. She quietly watched him through the evening, noticing every small detail, how he fidgeted with the sleeves of his jacket, how he barely spoke, how he stayed close to Ethan but seemed distracted, as if torn between wanting to be near him and wanting to escape, and every small action felt like a silent signal Laura couldn't fully read yet, but she knew it mattered. When the boys eventually left the room to do homework, Laura remained alone in the living room for a long moment, listening to the soft hum of the rain outside and replaying the look in Michael's eyes. That mixture of fear, longing, and confusion that didn't belong to a simple teenage worry, and her thoughts swirled with possibilities. Was he in trouble? Was he hurting? Was he struggling with something about school or home? Or was it something even more personal, something about his heart, something about someone he cared for? She sighed deeply, letting her hand rest on the back of the chair, knowing that sometimes young people carried emotions they had no idea how to express, and the people around them could only wait patiently for the truth to find its way out. Though the rest of the day passed without Michael saying another word about it, the memory of him standing frozen in the middle of her living room stayed with Laura like a soft ache, leaving her with the unshakable feeling that his silence wasn't just hesitation, it was fear of being misunderstood, fear of changing the world around him with a truth he wasn't ready to share. And as she cleaned the dishes that evening, her mind kept circling back to one simple question that refused to leave her. What was Michael so afraid to say? 2 evenings later, the rain had stopped, but the quiet inside the Bennett house felt heavier than before as Laura set dinner on the table and watched Ethan and Michael sit across from her. And even though she tried to act normal, she couldn't ignore how Michael kept his eyes on his plate as if it held every answer he was afraid to say out loud. Throughout the meal, he barely spoke, only giving short replies when Ethan joked or asked questions. And every time Ethan laughed, Michael smiled for a second but then quickly went blank again, as though joy was something he had to borrow, not something he could feel. When Laura served dessert, warm apple pie that both boys usually loved, Ethan's phone rang and he stepped outside to answer it, leaving Michael alone at the table with his untouched slice, and Laura sensed immediately that the quiet between them was the same quiet that filled the living room the day he tried to speak. She sat down gently, leaning forward so he didn't feel pressured, and asked if he wanted to talk, and Michael's eyes lifted only halfway before dropping again, his fingers tapping nervously against the side of the plate, his breath uneven like he was fighting against the weight of his own words. After a long moment, he whispered that he was sorry for being strange and that he didn't want to make things uncomfortable, but Laura shook her head softly and assured him he hadn't done anything wrong. And that was when his shoulders sagged, not from relief but from exhaustion. Like he had been carrying something alone for months. He admitted that there was something important he was holding inside, something that scared him because he didn't understand it fully himself, and he said the person involved was someone important, someone I shouldn't feel this way about, and the way he said it made Laura's heartbeat quicken, not out of fear but out of worry for him, because young hearts often misunderstood the storms inside them. Michael wiped his fingers on his jeans, not realizing his hands were shaking until he tried to steady them, and he blinked fast, trying to hide tears that pushed at the corners of his eyes. He confessed that he had tried to talk that day in the living room but panicked because the feelings inside him didn't make sense, they felt too strong and yet too confusing, and he feared saying them out loud would turn his world upside down. He added that sometimes he felt like he was floating between two places, wanting to speak and wanting to run. And that every time he came close to letting the truth out, his chest tightened and the words died in his throat. Laura listened carefully, not interrupting, letting him talk at his own pace, and she could see that what he felt wasn't childish or dramatic, it was real emotion, the kind that makes a person afraid of being misunderstood. She told him softly that he was safe in her home and safe with her, reminding him that sharing feelings didn't make him weak, but Michael just shook his head, saying he couldn't tell her yet, not because he didn't trust her but because he wasn't ready to accept the truth himself. His voice wavered when he said he didn't want to ruin anything, especially not his friendship with Ethan or the comfort he felt in their home, and Laura felt a warm ache inside because she realized this boy wasn't just afraid of rejection, he was afraid of hurting people he cared about. When Ethan came back inside, cheerful and completely unaware, Michael sat up straighter and wiped his face quickly, hiding all signs of emotion, as though none of it had happened, and Laura watched the wall go back up, the one he had almost let fall. Ethan began talking about a school project, and Michael nodded along, pretending to listen, but his eyes were cloudy, his smile weak, and Laura could see he was barely holding himself together. Later, when Ethan went to his room, Michael stood quietly by the front door, thanking Laura for dinner with a polite voice that sounded nothing like the trembling one he had used minutes earlier, and as he stepped outside into the cool evening air, Laura stood in the doorway and watched him walk down the sidewalk alone, his hands in his pockets, his head lowered as though he was trying to hold his feelings in place so they wouldn't spill out before he reached home. She closed the door slowly, wondering who this important person was and what truth was so heavy that it made a gentle-hearted boy tremble, and as she cleaned the kitchen that night, her thoughts circled around Michael like a quiet storm, leaving her with a single, lingering question that felt larger than anything he had said. Was he falling for someone he believed he could never have? And if he was, how long could he carry that secret before it broke him from the inside? 2 days later, Michael appeared at the Bennett house unexpectedly, standing on the porch with his hands tucked into his jacket pockets, his posture tense and hesitant, and Laura could tell immediately that this wasn't a casual visit because his eyes darted to the ground before meeting hers, carrying the same nervous weight she had seen before. And as she opened the door, she gestured for him to come in, and he stepped inside slowly, as if crossing an invisible line he had been afraid to approach for weeks, and they moved to the living room, sitting on opposite ends of the couch in a quiet tension broken only by the ticking clock on the wall, the sound echoing the pulse in Laura's chest as she tried to stay calm while waiting for him to speak. Michael took a deep breath, fidgeting with the zipper of his jacket and tapping his fingers against his knees, his voice barely above a whisper as he said he had been trying for months to ignore the feelings that had built inside him, pretending they weren't there, and that every day it became harder to pretend, until finally he realized he couldn't hide it anymore without hurting himself, and Laura leaned forward slightly, her voice soft, encouraging him to say what he needed to say, assuring him that he could trust her, and he swallowed hard, tears threatening to spill as he finally spoke the words he had kept buried for so long, admitting in a trembling voice that he had feelings for her, that he cared for her in a way that felt deep, confusing, and frightening all at once, that he had never meant to feel this way, and that he understood it was complicated, maybe even impossible, because he was young, and she was someone he had always seen as a guiding figure, someone he respected and admired, yet the heart doesn't always follow rules, and he couldn't stop the way he felt, and Laura's chest tightened with a mixture of surprise and compassion, knowing that what he was expressing wasn't about desire in a harmful sense but about the need to be seen, to share a truth that had been weighing on him, a raw, vulnerable honesty that left him trembling, and she reached out to place a comforting hand on his shoulder, a gesture of reassurance, of warmth, of understanding, letting him know that emotions like this were human and that he was safe, and Michael's lips quivered as he admitted that every time he was near her, he felt a sense of peace and safety that he didn't feel anywhere else, that it scared him because it was so strong, and he didn't know how to reconcile the admiration and love he felt with the knowledge that nothing could happen between them, and Laura listened, heart aching, nodding gently, feeling honored by his trust and wanting to help him see clarity without shaming him for his feelings, explaining softly that what he was experiencing was natural for a young person discovering the intensity of emotions for someone who made them feel cared for, and that sharing those feelings, even if they couldn't lead to a romantic connection, was an important step in learning about himself, and Michael wiped a tear quickly, embarrassed but relieved, admitting that saying the words made him feel lighter even if the fear of misunderstanding lingered, and Laura smiled gently, telling him that the world would not judge him for being honest, and that he could carry this experience as a memory of courage and sincerity rather than guilt, that emotions were part of life, and understanding them took time, and he nodded slowly, taking in every word, feeling a warmth of acceptance that he hadn't felt from anyone before, and as they sat together in the quiet room, the tension slowly eased, the storm inside him calming just a little, because he had finally shared the truth, and Laura reassured him again that he was a wonderful young man with a kind heart, that he didn't need to rush past these feelings but instead could let them teach him about empathy, honesty, and emotional courage, and Michael nodded, a small smile breaking through the lingering worry on his face, realizing that though his feelings might be complicated and fleeting, acknowledging them made him stronger, more self-aware, and ready to move forward, and as he stood to leave, he thanked Laura sincerely, not with awkwardness but with gratitude, looking her in the eyes with honesty and relief, and she told him he had done the right thing by sharing, and when he stepped out into the soft evening air, his shoulders seemed lighter, his steps more confident, and Laura watched him walk away with a gentle smile, knowing that he had grown emotionally that day, that the courage to speak his heart had shifted something inside him, that he had faced his vulnerability and survived it, and as she closed the door and leaned against it, she felt a quiet pride and warmth, understanding that young hearts often carry truths that are difficult to voice, and that sometimes the most important thing an adult can do is listen with patience, compassion, and care, letting them know they are not alone in their feelings, and she realized that Michael's confession, though complicated and unexpected, was a beautiful moment of honesty, trust, and emotional growth, a turning point for a boy learning to navigate the depths of his own heart. And that by letting him speak, she had helped him take a small but meaningful step toward understanding himself and the world around him, leaving the evening full of gentle hope and the quiet promise of healing hearts. A week passed in quiet reflection, and Laura noticed that Michael hadn't visited the house, leaving a small emptiness in the usual rhythm of their evenings, and though she tried to focus on other tasks, her mind kept returning to the image of him standing on the porch 2 days earlier, vulnerable and honest, carrying feelings too big for a teenager to understand, and she wondered how he was coping, whether he was feeling relief, confusion, or lingering fear, until one Saturday afternoon, Michael appeared at the door once more, this time with a shy, tentative smile and a hint of newfound confidence in his posture, and Laura felt a warm rush of relief because the boy looked lighter, freer, and ready to face the world outside of his inner turmoil, and she welcomed him inside with a gentle nod, noticing how his eyes met hers for a brief moment before quickly dropping again, a habit that had not entirely left him, yet the difference was clear, There was no longer the tension that had once made him tremble, and he seemed prepared to speak without breaking under the weight of what had haunted him for so long. They settled in the living room, the evening sun casting golden light across the floor, and Michael spoke first, softly but with a clarity that wasn't there before, telling her that he was doing better, that he had spent the week thinking about everything he had shared and learning to understand his feelings, that he realized the emotions he had felt for her were not the kind that could grow into a relationship but rather an innocent longing for safety, care, and acknowledgement, the kind of feeling that comes from admiration and trust rather than romantic desire, and Laura nodded, understanding completely, feeling proud of the growth she could see in him, and he continued, saying that speaking his truth had made him realize the importance of honesty with himself and others, that it had been scary to admit what he felt, but in doing so, he had learned resilience, empathy, and self-awareness, and he thanked her for being patient, for listening without judgment, and for giving him space to confront the emotions that had felt overwhelming and dangerous in their intensity. Michael admitted that at first he thought he was in love with her, that he had misunderstood the safety and warmth he felt around her as something deeper, but over the days, he had come to recognize that it was admiration, comfort, and the feeling of being truly seen, and he expressed gratitude that she had allowed him to explore and express his feelings without fear of scolding or shame, telling her that it had helped him grow and that he could now think about the future with a sense of balance and clarity he didn't have before. Laura smiled gently, telling him that feelings like his were part of growing up, that they often came with confusion and intensity, and that learning to navigate them with honesty and respect for oneself and others was an essential life lesson. And Michael's expression softened as he absorbed this wisdom, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders because he no longer needed to hide the emotional journey he had endured, and for the first time, he seemed fully comfortable in his own skin around her. Ethan came bounding down the stairs, full of energy and completely unaware of the emotional conversation that had taken place, and Michael laughed freely, that easy, genuine laugh that had been missing for weeks, showing the return of the playful, light-hearted friend Ethan loved. And Laura watched the two boys interact, chatting about weekend plans and school projects, and she realized that Michael had reclaimed his confidence, his joy, and his sense of normalcy without denying what he had felt or who he was, and that the courage to speak his truth had not only brought him peace but had strengthened the bond of trust between them, leaving her with a warm, contented feeling that only comes from witnessing emotional growth and resilience. Before leaving, Michael turned back briefly, giving Laura a small, sincere smile and saying, almost shyly, "Thank you for letting me share my truth," and in that simple phrase lay months of fear, vulnerability, and personal growth, and Laura felt a quiet pride and tenderness, knowing that he had learned to honor his emotions without being overwhelmed by them, and as she closed the door behind him, she felt a gentle sense of closure mixed with hope, understanding that young hearts often carry feelings too heavy to face alone, and that with patience, compassion, and care, they could emerge stronger, wiser, and more capable of navigating the complexities of emotion and relationships. The evening light faded, leaving a calm, golden glow in the room, and Laura reflected on the journey of the past week, the trembling moments, the quiet confessions, the fear of misunderstanding, the courage to speak, and the peaceful resolution, and she knew that Michael's story, though delicate and personal, was a testament to the power of honesty, empathy, and human connection, a reminder that emotional growth comes from facing feelings honestly, seeking understanding, and finding safe spaces to express the heart's truths. And as she watched the empty porch outside, she felt a warm satisfaction knowing that a young boy had stepped into maturity gently, carrying lessons of courage, self-awareness, and emotional resilience that would guide him through the challenges and joys of life, leaving the story with a quiet, heartfelt ending that promised hope, healing, and the gentle beauty